Why are there so many podcasts about Tottenham? Do I want to know why? They might contain insight, but mostly delusions. If I hear one more, I might die. They don't like Levy and they don't like Enoch. They pine for Moo and Conte. Someday we'll like 'em, old Tottenham Hotspur, the podcast clout chasers and me.
Hello, you lovely people, and welcome to another episode of Tottenham Hotspur, that new Spurs podcast about Spurs podcasts that's beginning to lose its novelty? ? Yes, I'm still doing this. My name is Ian, and I'm pretty tired of life, of Spurs, and because I'm recording this at 9 p.m. and I'm an old man. Before I get started, if you like the pod, if you like what I'm doing here, you can follow me on Bluesky at poddenampodspur.bsky.social, and that's really the only place that I think I'll be uploading to anytime soon. So why am I tired of Spurs? Well, yesterday on the 3rd of April, Spurs lost a London derby to Chelsea in a game that's main highlight was Ange Postecoglou having a tiff with the fans. It's an all-time low. Pap Sarr scored a goal, an absolute beautiful strike from 30 yards out that was eventually ruled out thanks to VAR. And he turned to the crowd and cupped his ear, specifically to this travelling Spurs support who had been giving him lip. You know, we can get into the behaviours later, but he turned around and he basically goaded them. So there's a lot of gnashing and wailing from the Spurs podcast this week, and you know, you can blame them or not, and I don't really want to judge at this point. But yeah, not great. We've got Southampton on Sunday, so I'm recording this Friday night, the day after Spurs lost to Chelsea, like I said, and a bit of time before Southampton. So before I dig into generally where Spurs podcasts are, I am going to be talking specifically about one show. That's kind of the format that I want to take this show towards. I'd like to focus on one big pod once a week, and then just give you some highlights. And, you know, if you've been listening, you've probably picked up on that already. So this week I'm going to be talking about something which is very much in my wheelhouse. It's one of my regular podcasts that I listen to on rotation every week, and it's Rule The Roost. And the interesting thing about Rule The Roost compared to other Spurs podcasts is it's very much the singular vision now of its host, Jack. Jack has been in the public eye for about 15 years now, at least in kind of an internet famous sense. First as, you know, T-Trunk, many of you might know him as, starting out with comedy videos that really captured the mood and zeitgeist of where Spurs fans were in the early-ish, sort of pre-Reddit internet, I guess. And what I like about Jack is that I feel like he really understands Spurs fans. You know, he has grown up a Spurs fan. He's incredibly passionate about Spurs, as you might expect, for having spent, you know, best part of 2 decades making content that's incredibly popular. But there's a sense with his videos and with his podcast that he gets what makes us tick, and I like that a lot. In terms of the podcast scene, he goes way back with Flav of the Fighting Cock. He was a season 1 regular on that show. They have talked in the past about how they met on internet message boards, you know, 20 plus years ago. So there's like a really interesting DNA that makes up some parts of the Tottenham podosphere. So he started his own podcast, Rule The Roost, about 10 or so years ago, with Raj Baines, and I think later they added Seb Stafford-Bloor. And they had a really cool, unique selling point, which was that every week they would try to interview fans, preferably podcasters, from whatever team Spurs were playing. So I remember specifically there were some really good shows with some Geordies, some Newcastle fans that they got on regularly. And I feel like they had some really good interviews or conversations, maybe better way to phrase it, with Everton fans too. So that was a really cool idea, and I would love if that were to come back in some fashion. Maybe not on Rule the Roost. That doesn't seem to be where Jack is taking it. But if someone else wanted to take that idea and run with it, I would love to see us have more of that kind of cross-pollination between different Spurs fans and opposition fans. I think that's a really interesting viewpoint. And actually, my mate Mike runs a podcast that's very much based on that kind of format, I guess. But it's always the same people every week. So it's him, who's a Spurs fan, with a Brighton fan and an Aston Villa fan predominantly. And so you get that nice, friendly exchange with a bit of banter from three clubs, which are kind of all in the same space. And that show is called Rooster and the Villain, and I'll link to it in the show notes. I haven't talked about it on the pod yet, but that's because they've been on a bit of a hiatus, I think, in terms of talking about the Premier League. But I'm not here to talk about that podcast. Sorry, Mike. I'm talking about Rule the Roost. So it's very much an interesting show as it was 10 years ago. You've got Raj Baines, who went on to become, I believe, communications director at Huddersfield Town. Maybe he's somewhere else now. Seb Stafford-Bloor, of course, is now a very successful sports journalist covering predominantly the Bundesliga for The Athletic. And so over that time, as those two left, Jack went through another kind of evolution or maturation in his relationship with Spurs media creation, taking on a new sort of veneer onto the podcast, keeping very much his opinions at the forefront, and it becoming more of the Jack Show, which is fine because, as I said before, he very much understands Spurs fans, what Spurs fans care about. So getting that viewpoint into a regular show is really quite impressive. Some people might criticize him for being too negative, and I have seen that online. I feel like anything you read about him being too critical or too negative this season should be taken with a pinch of salt because of just kind of everything that's happened. We're at the point now in the season where we've lost 20 games in all competitions. If people are going to be negative, they've certainly got the reason to be so. And some of this is also how about we evaluate Tottenham as a football club. And I feel like Jack on the Rule the Roost has a very long reflective or backwards viewpoint that he shares. He's talking about his upbringing, the football he watched as a kid, and he's integrating that with what's happening now. And I think, relatively speaking, compared to some other podcasts that I might talk about soon, he has quite a short forward view into what's going to happen in the future, generally speaking. He tends to lean optimistic when looking forward, but in the moment, he's very much in his feelings sometimes, and this season it's been hard to be that type of commentator. But I feel like I particularly enjoy that when I tune into his reaction pods. These are put out usually within an hour, a few hours after the final whistle blows. He gets on YouTube. I never really watch them live, just because of life getting in the way. But he sits there. He talks about what he thinks. He goes through player by player, what his evaluation of them was, and he has a lot of community feedback that he integrates into his talking head. But it's pretty good. He never really skips over or ignores opinions in the comment sections which deviate from his own, which I value. He may not endorse them, but he's certainly putting them out there and usually giving them some sort of acknowledgement, a quick fair enough, something else just to show that he's seeing them. He's not trying to skip over these alternative viewpoints, and I think that's important, and I think it all comes back to him understanding Spurs fans. His midweek reflection pods are usually with friends and other guests. They're pretty good. I feel like his reaction pods are something which I value much more at the moment. That's probably just because of needing content as soon as a game is over, as opposed to the quality of those midweek reflections, which can sometimes have very good insights, and I do like it. And so, especially this week, which I'll get into in a minute, those reflections and those conversations he has with people he feels very comfortable with can bring up quite novel, or at least noteworthy concepts. And a quick note on another sort of type of episode that he puts out there. Last season, in the summer break, he was creating episodes that were looking at Spurs history season by season, that was specifically focused on the shirts that Spurs were wearing on the pitch. I forget the name of that series, but I'm planning on covering those type of evergreen episodes from different podcasts when we get into our own summer break. So generally speaking, the current vibe is not overly positive coming from him. He's acknowledging that in his follow-up pod to his reaction pod this week. Sort of midweek pod, I guess, but it's on a Friday. It exposed some of Jack's willingness to engage in self-reflection, and he acknowledged his glumness on the reaction pod, and I think that that's valuable, that we have voices out there who are willing to sort of step back and say, okay, what am I putting out into the universe? What effect am I having on others potentially? What I will say about this week's reaction pod was that it was much more raw. He was much more annoyed with some of the stuff that happens, and part of me thinks, is this a stages of grief type of thing? He's very sad immediately after the game ended, and now he's moving into a phase of anger. I wouldn't say he was particularly rage-filled, but he was clearly more pissed off on the second pod of the week. But what caught my ear in the reaction pod was something that Jack said about particularly vocal Ange Postecoglou supporters. And I don't want to single him out, because I've been hearing this a lot from people online and in other podcasts. You might have heard it referred to as the Ange cult. And this is why I wanted to focus on Rule The Roost this week. As I mentioned earlier, I think Jack gets Spurs fans, and if he spots something in the fan base, I think it's worth paying attention. You don't have to follow his assessment of the situation, but he's certainly attentive to the wants and needs and feels of Spurs fans. So I'm concerned about this because of the sort of growing culture war that's happening in the Spurs fan base. There are people who are, and I'm not going to express this well, so I'm very sorry about that, but there are people who are feeling very defensive on certain topics. And at the moment, we're focused specifically on Ange Postecoglou. He's become a lightning rod for criticism of the club as a whole. And again, this is a theme that runs through all of the podcasts that I listened to this week, especially post-Chelsea. People are saying that the players are decent. They're not really focusing on Levy at the moment, although I expect that to change after the fan protest that's taking place on Sunday. But they're expressly focusing all of their attention and vitriol and disappointment on Ange Postecoglou as a manager. And me, as an individual who has absolutely no influence on whether or not he has a job or not, I'm at the point where he can stay or go. I like what he's trying to do. I liked the type of performance that he was putting out into the media early on in his Spurs career, but it seems like we've broken him. And it's kind of interesting that the point we're at now, with him cupping his ear to goad the fans after a goal, comes almost a year, give or take a month, from falling out with the fans over potentially throwing a game against Man City to make sure that Arsenal didn't win the league. And I feel like we're at a really weird inflection point, at least as a club, and as a club with a relationship with a manager, where we're moving from the old style focus of the unwritten rules of football support, which is that fans, especially away fans, can heckle and jeer as much as they want, and managers and players generally have to take it within certain boundaries. You know, no one's going to go full Eric Cantona and kick somebody in the head. But we're seeing something now with Ange where he's calling out our fan base. And I think that's really dangerous, potentially, as a coach, because you lose the fans. It's not long until you lose your job. But maybe this is something that we'll see more and more of as time progresses, of managers pushing back on the norms that we've long held as core to football support, which is we are the consumer and we have to be placated to at all costs. Maybe I'm just over analyzing a singular point in a particularly disappointing season, both for him professionally, for the players professionally, and for the fans and the sort of cultural and social importance that the football club has to us. But regarding the comment from Jack about Anjin supporters and them being particularly, I think, patronizing, aggressive, people have called them a cult. It's interesting because I haven't really seen this in my experiences. I haven't heard people really calling people stupid. I hear this a lot. I think Jack refers to it a number of times in this podcast, in his reaction pod, post-Chelsea, and over the previous few months. And I'm really disappointed that this is happening. As for why I'm not seeing it, I think there are a few different reasons. Maybe it's because I'm just an asshole who thinks this is how people should talk to each other. Maybe Bluesky's particularly aggressive block functions have erased these interactions from my line of sight. Or maybe I think the really interesting point is that maybe there were just a few very vocal, very defensive commentators out there who, when criticized of their own viewpoints and their own, you know, who are just trying to put out into the universe their way of supporting Spurs, are receiving criticisms. And they're pushing back. And this pushback is creating pushback, which has a negative sort of feedback loop. Doubling down on your own defensiveness, I suppose. As to where we go from here, that worries me quite a lot. I think winning cures all evils, you know, in football. We start winning some games, everything will be hunky-dory in the fan base. But I'm concerned that won't come for many months, at least in a consistent fashion. You know, lift the Europa League and all sins will be forgiven, but my confidence in that happening is dwindling by the day. So, just looking through my notes, trying to see if there's any way for me to end a review of Rule The Roost that doesn't focus on one single thing that Jack said. I like the show. I like it a lot, in fact. I like Jack. I think he seems like a decent guy with a decent personality. I like the way that he phrases things. He's a really good communicator. And I think that comes across in something that I said earlier about being in the sort of public eye, even in some small sort of Spurs internet fan perspective. For 15 years, you don't do that unless you have a very clear sense of self, a very clear sense of the product that you're making content about, and also the people who are receiving it. And that's come across in his multiple different iterations of of the way that he expresses himself through media, from videos nearly 20 years ago to a really interesting take on interacting with other fan bases 10 years ago to the current day, where it's him and a microphone most of the time, but really integrating all of those experiences into something which other people can bounce their own feelings off of on a weekly basis sometimes. And that's very cool, very innovative. And, you know, the downside is he is very out there with his opinions. I don't mind, because my opinions generally probably seem to sort of fall into the same universe as his. He's well known at this point, and you like him or you don't. I don't think he particularly cares, but just like leave him alone if you don't like what he's saying. His pod this week was good. Give it a listen. You should give every podcast I talk about a listen if you can, because I don't want anybody to think that I'm trying to take listeners away from them. But everybody this week is working with kind of crummy raw materials. We just lost to Chelsea. Ange Postecoglou is potentially winding up the fans and lying to them afterwards. Things ain't great. But what is great is my lightning round coverage of the post-Chelsea pods. Seamless transition. I'm actually going to talk about a few podcasts from earlier in the week as well, which I think generally still hold up. But yeah, let's kick off with some post-Chelsea podcasts that I listened to today. An interesting game, if you have any time to listen to these podcasts, is like a manager treasure hunt. So names that are being mentioned across these podcasts that I've listened to in the last week or so include Pochettino, Iraola, Marco Silva. Is this a Marco Silva? Let's go with Silva. Ryan Mason, Matt Wells, Harry Redknapp, Rafa Benitez, and Thomas Frank. So, you know, maybe have a bingo card. All right, so let's kick off with a View from the Lane. Jack Pitbrook was on this week with Danny Kelly, as well as Jay Harris. And Jack summed up the vibe of that podcast within like the first 5 minutes. He described us as a bad team with some good days. There was a common thread with Rule The Roost. Jack expressed disillusionment with the modern game. That's Jack Pitbrook, not Jack Titrunk. He was coming from a VAR perspective, ruling out Sarr's excellent goal, but also Chelsea's goal that was ruled out. Jack on Rule The Roost was coming at it from more like a general fan experience, comparing now to the football that he grew up with. That was in his conversation with Phil in his follow-up pod. Danny Kelly also had some interesting comments about the Australian media over the international break, kind of pandering to Ange Postecoglou's ego, which is perhaps a bit of a I've perhaps mischaracterized what he said, but I think that was the sum of it. I listened to a new podcast this week, Tottenham Boys Making All the Noise. Thanks to the lads who reached out to me on Bluesky. I gave you a listen. I enjoyed it. I found them to be generally jovial, and if I'm honest, at the moment with the way that Spurs are, and maybe it's just because of the volume of podcasts that I've now committed myself to listening to on a weekly basis, I find listening to new podcasts refreshing. I enjoyed this, and I'll come back to it. I listened to The Cheese Room. There was a mix of Brits and a single Canadian on this week. I liked it. I like this kind of mixture of different ways of exploring football concepts and football experiences. I think that they meshed it together well. Sounds patronizing, but maybe as a Brit living in America, as a naturalized citizen, maybe I just enjoy hearing both a North American accent and a British accent at the same time. Seb did call Ange a fraud at one point, so viewer or listener beware. There was some pushback and discussion on this though. Fighting Cock this week, Fighting Cock today on Friday, was hosted by Ricky, which was I made a very excited noise in my office when I heard that Ricky was hosting. Get well soon to Flav, who just had surgery. Nick was back as well. I like listening to Nick. I think he seems like a cool dude. And Mark was there as well for a bit of tactical and Scandinavian nous. It was a cathartic experience. I'd recommend it if you get a chance to listen to it before Southampton. I enjoyed it. And then I listened to Last Word on Spurs, but only the first hour and at like 1.5 speed. Crackers joined, plus some other regulars, and I have to say this makes such a difference to Last Word on Spurs, having people who know each other and can bounce off each other well and are giving each other time to talk versus I think the podcast that I covered in my first episode like 2-3 weeks ago, where it was very combative. This was much more of a panel discussion, and I enjoyed that. Very focused on fan and coach behavior in the first hour and what's acceptable and what's expected. So that was an interesting discussion. But what about stuff that I listened to this week that was pre-Chelsea, that is still kind of evergreen? So the 1882 podcast had an interesting rant about Jed Spencer's appearance on Rio Ferdinand's pod. This was the first criticism I've heard of Jed doing this. Mostly it's been glowing praise for the way that he expressed himself and the stories that he told. This was a different take, and I found that refreshing. I don't know if I agree, though. The Lab had an interview with Kieran Maguire about the financial report, the Spurs end of financial year statement that was put out. You know, we've all talked about it, but I like that Flav has this platform for bringing in experts to comment on Spurs. Hometown Glory was great this week. There was a really good interview with Mickey Kerr. He's a writer, and they were talking all about what a fan football revolution would look like. This is a must listen this week. Really enjoyed it. I gave Same Old Spurs some time. They're back from a few weeks away, and they provided my take of the week, which is aged like milk. So I think it's Majestic who said it. Madge. No one could make an argument for me that Harry Redknapp would do a worse job than Ange Postecoglou. No one in the world. This was maybe hours or days before a video of Harry Redknapp pulling let's call it a Roman salute and making xenophobic comments about Thomas Tuchel. Just chef's kiss. Beautiful timing. I feel so bad for them putting this out there into the world. Because I totally disagree. And, you know, he will no chance be better than Ange Postecoglou with this current setup. He hasn't managed for many years. And he's also clearly stuck in the Stone Age. Love Harry Redknapp, love what he did with Spurs, but this thing soured almost within minutes of it being put up online. And then finally, my mates at CADS Come and Discuss Spurs are re-uploading old podcasts to their various new podcast feeds, like Apple Podcasts or whatever, including an interview that me and Owen did with Stu months ago. So if you feel like wanting to hear about me and Owen talk about Bluesky and Bluesky Spurs, go and give it a listen. So let's wrap everything up. What did we learn this week? Well, Spurs fans are focusing on their experiences and their behaviors and less so on tactics. This makes sense. There isn't a visible identity for the tacticos to really sink their teeth into, and the key flashpoint this week included the fans. So my suggestion this week would be, if you have time and you want to listen to something before the Southampton game, look for something that's going to make you feel good. And you know what? Over the next few weeks, that should be the focus. If something's going to make you feel good, if something's going to validate your opinions and that's what you want to hear, if you want to hear just people vibing and enjoying each other's company, go for that. So, at the end of the podcast, I've been talking now for 28 minutes, which is an amazingly consistent amount of time compared to my first two podcasts too. It must be like some kind of atomic clock in my brain for how long I can talk into a microphone by myself for. Once again, if you like the podcast, follow me on Bluesky. Thank you again to Neb Economou for the absolutely cracking, incredible intro music that he made. And thank you for listening. and keep making Tottenham podcasts.